How did two countries regularly accused of abusing human rights win seats on the UN group whose job it is to protect people? China and Russia will be preaching about how best to keep people safe. So who's going to take them seriously? This is Roundtable. Good to have your company. I'm David Foster. The UN Human Rights Council has also voted in Cuba. It was a win for tyrants, said the United States, which itself pulled out of the group 2 years ago. The Human Rights Council is the UN body given the job of promoting and protecting human rights worldwide by investigating alleged breaches. After the addition of Russia, China and Cuba, human rights campaigners are outraged. The countries accused of regularly abusing human rights on a large scale are now sitting on a body that is meant to protect them. Like arsonists joining the fire service, is how one group put it. China has been accused of genocide against its Uyghur minority. Russia routinely silences dissent and political opposition and is charged with using a nerve agent recently against the government critic Alexei Navalny, something that it denies. The Council's members are chosen by a secret ballot, and all kinds of deals can be done to secure other countries' votes, which brings into question the credibility of the UN body and whether it needs reform. We're very pleased to say that joining us on Roundtable out of Los Angeles, we can say hello, first of all, to Gisu Nia, human rights lawyer and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. We travel across the country to Washington, D.C., the capital, where we see Sophie Richardson, China director at Human Rights Watch. And then we go to Ramallah in the occupied West Bank, where we see Sari Bashi, human rights lawyer who works for Democracy for the Arab World. Well, very good of you all to join us. This question is for all three of you, one at a time, if you would. It's been described, the United Nations Human Rights Council, as a toothless debating society with no power outside Geneva. Sophie, you first. Right or wrong there?
I think overly simplistic. This is an institution that's capable of delivering scrutiny and accountability, investigations into situations ranging from the Rohingya to North Korea. But it's correct in the sense that it's an institution made up of governments, and a lot of what happens is subject to what individual governments do or don't want to discuss.
What has it achieved, Gisu? Do you think it's worth its place in the world hierarchy?
Look, it's the best thing we've got. It supports the OHCHR, which is the UN Human Rights Office, and without that, there would be, things from Syria, ranging to even looking at police brutality in the US that would go unanswered. And so it's the best thing we've got.
And sorry, what about having China and Russia on there? Does it make a mockery of it?
It certainly doesn't enhance the reputation of the Human Rights Council. I think in that sense, the problem is less that China and Russia were elected. The problem is why weren't there more countries running for those slates so that we could have had options? Certainly China and the human rights record of China and Russia is not a record that I would want to be evaluating human rights in other countries.
You see, one of the things I came across when I was looking into this was from on a website called Relief Web. It's a humanitarian information, it says, provided by the United Nations, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA. And it says, the election of China and Russia undermines the credibility of the Human Rights Council, and it names other countries as well. This is the United Nations itself saying it undermines the credibility of the organization. So, Sophie?
Well, look, having serious human rights violators on the council is deeply problematic, and my organization campaigned against the election of Saudi, Russia, and China. But the fact that some of those states have made it onto the body doesn't mean that the body itself can't move ahead with serious initiatives to investigate gross human rights violations. One of the better examples recently was that while the Philippines sat on the council, the body did move ahead with establishing an inquiry into serious human rights violations, including extrajudicial executions there. The Chinese government will no doubt exploit whatever opportunities it spots to manipulate the council's agenda and resist scrutiny. But there are also ways in which being a member of the council actually invites more scrutiny, not prevents the possibility of it. I think there's that much more pressure on other council members to perform that function. But I also want to echo one of the points that just got made, which was that had one more reasonably acceptable government from Asia chosen to run in this slate, it's possible China might have lost. And I think that's a lesson for all of us when we're thinking about how to get a truly rights-respecting membership across the council.
Sorry, let me come to you since Sophie's just mentioned Saudi Arabia. It had been on the council. It didn't get voted on this time. What does that say about integrity?
Well, look, I think there's an indication not just that Saudi Arabia didn't get on, but that China, which I would say is the next worst human rights violator, got the least number of votes. There were 5 countries running in the Asia-Pacific slot for 4 slots. So that's a problem of the other countries who didn't choose to adequately contest the election, and basically led to a situation where we were going to have at least 2 of the 3, China, Russia, and China and Saudi Arabia getting on. So the fact that Saudi Arabia didn't get on is an indication that as we mark the 2-year anniversary of the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi dissident who was killed and dismembered at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, the world has taken notice, at least in that sense, and does not want the country that's become a symbol of brutal human rights violations and suppression of dissent to be sitting at that table of the Human Rights Council.
You see, I want to ask you when Bruno Stagno from Human Rights Watch, who Sophie you must work with, when he says, and we'll see this on screen, a stunning rebuke to Saudi Arabia under Mohammed bin Salman, the kingdom reaped what it deserves for its serious violation of human rights and war crimes abroad. To be voted off an international body is hardly reaping the whirlwind of condemnation and appropriation, is it? I mean, something more should be happening than this.
Well, let me put this in a China perspective, since that's what I spend all my time thinking about. We would certainly like to see actual accountability proceedings, prosecutions of the Chinese government officials who are responsible for, among other things, the arbitrary detention of 1 million Uyghurs simply on the basis of their ethnicity and their religion. Is China getting the lowest number of votes to rejoin the council a comparable punishment? Of course not. But does it reflect that there is deep skepticism about the Chinese government's human rights record at home and increasingly abroad, and the threat that it presents to the institution? Yes, and in that sense, I think that kind of criticism enables steps towards the kind of accountability proceedings that we would ultimately want to see.
I guess let me come to you, and we'll continue in the same vein. That document I quoted at the very beginning from OCHA, the UN body that said this undermined the work of the Human Rights Council, rather strangely, since they're both UN bodies, went on to say in its introduction that the Council provides an essential role in providing early warning of the risk factors that can lead to crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and genocide. But how has that stopped what is happening, let's say, to the Uyghurs in China?
I think one way in which the council really assists and the bodies that it supports assist are in documentation efforts. So yes, there would be a desire that this would provide some sort of deterrence factor. That does not always come to fruition, obviously, but the documentation is important for the prosecutions that come later. There are critical assessments that are carried out by the mandates that are authorized by this council that make a world of difference in terms of actually compiling the sort of documentation that one needs to advance these prosecutions. So there is a critical function. It does happen over years' time. Often the benefits are not clear in the moment, but I would argue that that documentation function is incredibly important. And if we strip that away, then we're missing something essential that we need for accountability efforts.
Is it along the lines of what President Lyndon Johnson said all those years ago, and he didn't quite use these words? It's better to have somebody inside the tent looking out than somebody outside the tent looking in. In other words, you can keep an eye on them that way.
One good example of this, and we'll see where it leads, is that Venezuela had actually been elected to the Human Rights Council last year. And that was met with a lot of criticism. However, during that same time, there was a mandate that was authorized to collect documentation on crimes against humanity and the other atrocities that the Maduro regime was committing in that same time period. So I think that should say something about countries coming onto the council and yet enjoying scrutiny, or maybe not enjoying scrutiny of their record, even while they are on the council. So yeah, that's a critical function.
Sorry, I know you wanted to say something. You can refer to what's been said in the interim, or just go back to where you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to just understand how the UN Human Rights Council fits into the UN system. So the UN Human Rights Council is a political body. There are professional human rights bodies within the UN, like, for example, the UN Human Rights Committee, which is a treaty body where you have experts who are chosen for their expertise, their scholarly work on human rights, evaluating countries' compliance with certain human rights treaties. The UN Human Rights Council is different. Like the Security Council, it's a political body. So it is the countries themselves who are represented in their capacity as countries. But unlike the Security Council, it is open to all countries for membership. And the distribution is regional. So every geographical region has representation, which makes it a more egalitarian, more inclusive political body than the UN Security Council. So of course, it doesn't have the power of force that the UN Security Council has, but it does have the power of shaming. And this is shaming and information, I should say, because the information can lead to the shaming. And that's actually a very strong goal, to be able to have countries evaluate each other.
Well, you may think, sorry, I'm going to interrupt here. You may think they feel shame, but clearly by continuing in the way that they do, countries that commit massive human rights violations don't feel shame.
Well, I mean, I can give you an example of one of the more recent steps that the UN Human Rights Council took that I think does have weight. So there had been a decision by the UN Human Rights Council to publish a list of businesses that are operating in unlawful Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. It's just a list, right? And the shame, to some extent, belongs to the Israeli authorities who are establishing and maintaining those unlawful settlements. But the businesses themselves were shamed. And so in advance of that list being published, we saw a number of businesses end their activities in the settlements that led to human rights violations. So that's an example of it. It's just a list, but it actually changed people's behavior in the real world.
Okay, and I know, Sophie, you want to come in. I'm going to get into the United States decision to leave the Council in just a moment, but please say what it was that made you sort of raise your hand as if to sort of interrupt.
Sure, I'm so sorry to have spoken over you, especially because I agree entirely with everything you just said.
Not a problem.
But let's also turn it around. You know, if the Chinese government wasn't so upset by the shaming, why does it invest considerable resources in trying to combat that? You know, the amount of time we now spend documenting the ways the Chinese government tries to prevent side events, shut down discussions, keep independent civil society from participating, advance its own resolutions. You know, it really puts an effort into spinning its own version of events.
But that doesn't mean it feels shame. It means that it doesn't want the criticisms to be out there affecting what it does.
It's true, but it responds. It doesn't just let it slide. You know, and I agree that it's not the same thing as, securing the kinds of outcomes we would want to see. But Beijing reacts to this kind of pressure, and I think that tells us that it's a forum worth fighting for and fighting in.
Okay, let's listen now to Nikki Haley. She was the US ambassador to the United Nations. This was back in 2018. And this was when the Trump administration said, enough, we don't want to be on the United Nations Human Rights Council anymore.
The Human Rights Council has been a protector of human rights abusers and a cesspool of political bias. Regrettably, it is now clear that our call for reform was not heeded. Human rights abusers continue to serve on and be elected to the Council. The world's most inhumane regimes continue to escape scrutiny.
So she says they don't want to be scrutinized in some way. That goes against, to some extent, what we've been discussing during this program, that they are quite prepared to be scrutinized and perhaps feel some kind of shame. But why did the United States decide that this was not for it? Was it simply because it felt that other countries were getting away with it, or did it have its own reason? What do you think?
Well, the stated reason was that they wanted this to invite sort of structural reform. and have this be a point at which, they're stepping away from the council in a very dramatic fashion would sort of invite the conversation around what this council has become. I would argue that no such thing has happened, as evidenced by the election of these different states that I think the US most likely would not want to be on the council. And the council has moved on, in a sense. I mean, this is what happens when there's a sort of US vacuum of power. Typically, when I would deal with member states on the council, urging them to vote for different resolutions, you could count on the US diplomats to démarche and sort of push votes in a direction that would be favorable. And now they're no longer there. And so I think they thought that this would be a moment in which it would really send a strong signal. And I don't think that's been achieved. I think other states have filled the vacuum.
So the silence, in a sense, after the US departure has been deafening. Do you think that's surprised America?
I can't speak for what the view is internally on how they view this. All I can say is that certainly from the perspective of somebody who engages with civil society and would like to see this be a moment where civil society is consulted more, where we would have a greater say in the sorts of votes that are happening, it is disappointing to not have states that one can rely on to push votes in a certain direction and to encourage the kind of conversation that we want to see about political and civil rights and freedoms. So I don't see that it's had any benefit.
You see, one of the criticisms of the United Nations Human Rights Council is that those who've got good humanitarian records, who sit on the council, don't do enough to condemn those with poor human rights records. In other words, they're protecting their own interests. Sophie, would that be fair to say that if you've got a reasonable business relationship with a country that's got questionable practices, you're quite likely to stay quiet, even though you should, if you're on that council, be speaking out?
Well, there's no doubt that some countries' diplomats, when you get them behind closed doors, have no trouble admitting that they don't want to be critical of the Chinese government because they fear economic repercussions. That said, if you look at the now 40 governments that in the last couple of weeks have spoken quite strongly about China's human rights record, it really runs the gamut of highly industrialized, fairly secure economies, all the way through to tiny, incredibly vulnerable economies that have chosen to put their names to statements that are very critical of Beijing. So I think there is a growing diversity of views out there and a willingness to stand up in the face of some pretty serious rights violations inside China, but also the threat, in response to the threat that the Chinese government poses to the UN human rights system itself.
I think in very articulate ways you have each one of you put forward a case why it's a reasonably good thing in its own way that Russia and China are on the Human Rights Council. They get scrutiny that way. But let's now try and discuss how the organization could be changed for the better. Sari, do you want to start on that one? What major changes need to be made to make it more useful and more credible?
Sure. I mean, I think in terms of credibility, we might think of having some requirements. For example, in order to join the Human Rights Council, you have to allow access to the UN special rapporteurs and other UN bodies who may come for human rights missions, right? That would be a wonderful way of, for example, making sure that countries like China and Saudi Arabia either cooperate with UN investigations or get off the council. I think another thing that would be helpful would be either having a mandate that the slates be open, that they be contested, because the vote itself is secret. So in theory, any member in the General Assembly could vote their conscience and not have to pay a political price for it. But the problem is, in this particular election, there was actually only one contested slate, which was the Asia Pacific slate. And there it was 5 countries running for 4 slates. So everybody else automatically got in. And you could change that, first of all, by mandating that there be more candidates, and also by trying to intervene in the kind of backdoor dealings where in different regions, countries will agree, okay, I won't run to let you get on. And that would guarantee that countries would have to be more competitive in getting onto the council.
Sophie, your thoughts on change for the better?
Yeah, I can't improve on those suggestions. They're I think, key. But I also think one of the other developments that's taken place in the last few months that's very important is the decision taken by the Human Rights Council in its last session to look at racism and police violence in the United States and to agree to look at one of the most powerful members of the UN system, a P5 member state, I think breaks an important taboo. And one of the logical next questions is, if the council can muster this kind of support to look at the US, why not China?
For those that don't follow international politics quite as closely, P5 being one of the members of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Forgive me if you already know that. I'm not trying to be patronizing, but let me move on to this one. So imagine if China stands up and starts to lecture other countries on what they should be doing about human rights abuses. Who's going to take any real notice? What power does China have there? Or Russia?
Well, it's interesting that over the last couple of years, the Chinese government has run a series of resolutions. The first one, all of them quietly or sort of subtly presenting threats to established international human rights norms. The first one enjoyed considerable success. The second one, not so much. And the third one, when it was put forward a couple of weeks ago, was then actually quietly withdrawn because I think the Chinese mission realized it didn't have much support. And to us, I think that indicates that there is a more critical view and a growing chorus of governments willing to be overtly, visibly, audibly critical of China, in a way that suggests member states know a disingenuous line when they see it.
So if you are China or Russia or other countries that have been mentioned, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Cameroon, etc., all of which have been criticized for human rights records, why would you want to put yourself in the stocks, in the fairground coconut shy, to have the world throw things at you? Why would you want to do it? Gisa, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I would say that, there's a lot of allies that they would build at the council. So keep in mind, there's 47 member states, and a lot of them have patchy human rights records. It's not like these are the only ones that, have questionable human rights practices. They build relationships behind the scenes. What I've seen in Geneva personally is that Russia and China will send their absolute best. So they will send their most talented in their ranks to go and create these relationships. And I think there's really a desire to try to change the dialogue. So China was typically focused on sort of development type initiatives. They've now moved much more into the peace and security sphere, the sort of, bread and butter of the UN, if you will. And so they're trying to exert influence elsewhere. And I think that the idea is let's change the frame. So it's not so much worrying about the scrutiny, but they've sent aid money to many different countries. They have these other relationships, and I've even seen over the period of 8 years how that's in the past 8 years that I've been doing advocacy, how that's influenced even my conversations, where states from the Latin American bloc and the Africa bloc will sort of pause and say that they'll need to reconsider their vote on certain initiatives if they think that it would fly in the face of China's opinion on it.
I don't want to put words into anybody's mouth, but what I'm hearing at the moment is that it's about self-interest rather than betterment of the world.
Well, look, I think most countries behaving at the UN are trying to advance their interests. I think the question is, how can we structure the system and also put pressure on other countries so that their interest will be to do a better job protecting human rights? And I think if you take a country like Saudi Arabia, it's an example of a country that cares deeply about its image. They're spending millions of dollars for lobbying the American government. They're putting on a show for the G20 next month to host it, to make themselves seem as if they're actually implementing reforms, which they are not. So I think the question is whether we can make the human rights reviews at the Council and in other parts of the UN substantial enough that we will reward countries not just for public relations, but for actually implementing change.
Yeah, you see, this is where I was going to end the program. And sorry to cut you short, sorry, but I'll go to Sophie to give her the last word. It's about PR, it's about self-interest. And if other countries can get something out of that, that's okay. It's imperfect, but it's what we have.
Well, I think Beijing clearly wants to burnish its reputation through something like a Human Rights Council member seat, but I think it actually has a bigger and broader agenda, which is actually to weaken some of the key mechanisms the system has to offer, not least through weakening treaty body requirements, trying to change rules about whether independent civil society can participate in discussions, even trying to essentially write out the idea of state accountability and replace it with dialogue. And I think the challenge is going to be not just to make the different parts of the UN human rights ecosystem function the way they should to hold abusive governments accountable, but to make sure that the system itself retains the integrity that it needs to perform those functions.
Well, I wonder what sort of integrity you actually have. You may be doing some good work, but if that's what integrity is, it's rather like dressing up a villain so they look a little bit better, it seems to me. But listen, thank you so much for all of your contributions. Great to have you on this round table from right the way across the world, from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. to the occupied West Bank. We thank you for taking part, and we thank you, wherever you are, for watching this round table. From me, David Foster, goodbye for now.